Hello and welcome to Legal Aid Explained, a project of the Greater Chicago Legal Clinic. I'm Adam Salzman. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Chicago Legal Clinic, and I am here today with Drew Curle, the supervisor of our expungement and sealing program. Drew is a specialist in criminal records, a topic that I know means a great deal to many people in the Chicagoland community, and we're going to discuss that today. Drew, tell me how you came to be involved in this practice area and what you've been able to accomplish for people in your time at the clinic.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and thanks for having me on. So I got into criminal records when I started working at Greater Chicago Legal Clinic. So that was, it'll be 13 years ago this August, so coming up quick on that anniversary. But I started doing it when I began and eventually got promoted to supervisor of the program. And yeah, we've been able to provide records relief for, I would say, thousands of Cook County residents or people with cases in Cook County who may no longer live here. So we provide a variety of assistance for expungement needs. We'll help people who don't already have an attorney at the expungement call. We'll help people who contact us directly about their expungement needs in Cook County. And we are part of the New Leaf, Illinois Alliance of providing legal services for people with cannabis arrests in their background. So that's a statewide partnership of which we're one of the agencies involved. Our services are generally almost all free. We do have a few things that we'll charge sliding scale or flat fees for, but that's a minority of our service. Overwhelmingly in criminal records, everyone gets free service from us.
So that's important to note. These services are completely free, and if you think you have an issue with criminal records that you could use some legal assistance with, you can contact Greater Chicago Legal Clinic and specifically Drew's program at 312-726-2938. So let's unpack all of the things that you just mentioned. First of all, what's the definition of expungement and sealing? Not everybody might know that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that can vary a little bit by state, I believe, too. So in Illinois, expungement refers to the police destroying their version of the record of an arrest or a case, and the clerk of court impounding the record so that only the person who had it can access it and only have to get a court order. Sealing is very similar, except for law enforcement retains their copy of the record. It's just sealed or hidden from public view. But the clerk's records are treated the same in either event. And so, generally speaking, a sealed record is as good as an expunged record for almost all purposes because it won't come up on a background check, and you can answer no when asked if you've ever been convicted of any offense. The only difference is if you get arrested again or are applying to work for law enforcement, they'll see their own sealed records at that point. And so that's an important distinction to keep in mind, but for most folks looking to get pass a background check for a job or housing, the sealed record will work just as well as an expunged.
So let's say I am someone who comes to you to seek either an expungement or the sealing of a criminal record. What are some of the reasons I might come in to seek that kind of a service from the clinic?
Yeah, so the most common is just jobs. Most jobs will do a background check these days, and so people want to get it off either because it's an outright bar to them getting hired, which in certain fields, like medical fields and many others, that's the case, or just because it looks bad and they don't want to have it coming back. Even non-convictions can be like that, where it's not supposed to be taken into account, but people will see them and the employer might just kind of decide, well, I don't want to hire you, even though they won't say that.
Right.
Besides employment, what's also very common in housing, the statistic I saw, which is from maybe a couple of years ago, but it was something like 90% of landlords do background checks before leasing to a new tenant. That's something it used to be only like bigger kind of corporate landlords did, but now with the internet, it's become very easy for even like an individual person landlord that's just leasing part of their home or something like that to do these kinds of checks. And so again, housing is a very common reason people will seek expungement services. Beyond that, there can be other reasons too. For instance, people may want to get their gun card, FOID card rights restored, and so that can be an issue sometimes. Occasionally you have, like I said, professional licensing in medical fields, but also others that require you to have a clean background check in order to get that license to practice in your profession. And then also sometimes It's not required, I don't think, for most schools, but a school may also ask about these kinds of things, and so people might want to do it even before they've begun, a training program or a higher education, and so you want to get that cleared off. And of course, alternatively, maybe you're finishing that program and you want to start in that field, and so that's kind of the job question come back around again.
Right. Okay. Well, so let's say I, for one of the reasons you just cited, to obtain a job, to obtain housing, to obtain some kind of a license or a permit, any number of these things, I have a record of an arrest or some kind of involvement with law enforcement in my background that I don't want to be required to disclose, and I contact the clinic, and I end up being scheduled for a consultation with Drew Curle or one of your supervisees. What happens? What can I expect when I come into the office?
Yeah, so prior to us meeting with you, we'll have probably taken the time to research your background, find the cases that you have in Cook County, because we can see those. And again, they're public records, so that's part of why you want to get them off. So by the time we're meeting with you, we'll kind of have an idea of what's going on. Generally speaking, these days we'll go off of that. If for some reason there's something unusual, we may ask for you to get a copy of your Chicago Police or Illinois State Police rap sheet, which you can get. But these days it's not required to file, and we generally don't need them anymore in order to see what your cases are. So that's a change in practice. It's a thing a few years ago we almost always needed a rap sheet. These days we generally do not. So instead, if you were to meet with me, we'd meet and discuss basically what you're eligible for. If you have any ineligible cases, we'll go over those and what the options on those might be.
So I'll stop you there.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about eligibility for expungement and sealing, and
Yeah.
what falls under which category in terms of eligibility for those services?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big question. So the general rule that covers almost everything is expungement is for non-convictions, sealing is for convictions. And so that means if you were found guilty of the crime and you served prison time or jail time, but also probation, conditional discharge, time considered served, which is while you're in jail awaiting trial, you plead guilty, and then your sentence is the time you already spent. Those are all considered convictions, and so generally speaking, you'll need to seal those, which again means law enforcement is retaining the record but hidden from public view. That's in contrast to a non-conviction, so that's a dismissed case or one where you're found now guilty after a trial. Those cases can always be expunged, and so that is, generally what you want to do since it's the stronger form of relief.
Right, because again, those records are destroyed. No one retains an expunged record.
Yes, no law enforcement does. The clerk does, but it's hidden from public view, and it's only you could access them, and only if you got an order from a judge to let you access it for some specific reason, and then it's immediately sealed again.
Okay, so that's an important distinction. Thanks for clarifying that. Continue.
Yeah, so that's the main thing. Expungement is for non-convictions. Sealing is for convictions. There are a handful of exceptions, the most important of which is regarding cannabis. So when Illinois legalized cannabis at the state level, one of the things they did was create a path for people to be able to expunge minor cannabis convictions. And so, I mentioned generally you can't expunge a conviction, but cannabis is an exception. So if you have minor cannabis convictions on your background, there's a special form you can use that we do all the time to expunge those cases outright instead of just sealing them. Related to which, too, if you're interested in it, if you've had that case previously sealed, it's possible to go in and expunge it now. And so occasionally we'll do that as well.
Right. So we're going to come back around to that. That's an important innovation and recent change in the law and in the process, and it definitely applies to a lot of people, so we want to make sure to discuss that.
Yeah.
So once you've had the meeting, once you've done the background assessment, determined eligibility, and so forth, then what happens?
So then at that point, we'd offer you the retainer contract. Again, almost always that's going to be pro bono, so all you have to do is just sign it and basically be telling us in writing you want our help. And then at that point, we'll prepare the petitions to expunge and seal. We'll have you approve them and then file them with the court. And so for there, it depends a little bit on if your cases are in the city of Chicago itself or suburban Cook County. The procedures are a little bit different. We cover cases everywhere, so if you have some cases here, some there, that's fine. Anything in Cook County will do. But ultimately, we'll file the case, and then we wait to see if anyone objects to it, which I can talk about more. And then eventually, if there is an objection, you'll have a court date where the judge decides whether to grant your case or not.
So let's talk about the process, assuming there's no objection. How do you land that plane? How does that come to its conclusion?
Yeah, so if there's no objection, then that means that after you filed it, the Cook County State's Attorney has reviewed the case, determined that there's no objection on their end. Technically speaking, the local arresting agency, Illinois State Police, and the city itself, so like the city of Chicago, for instance, can object as well. But in practice, they never do. I haven't seen that.
Almost always the state's attorney.
Yeah, so I haven't seen anyone other than them object in years at this point. So if the state's attorney says no objection, then that means, generally speaking, your case is going to be granted without need for an actual hearing. So in Chicago, we'd file a motion to set a court date. I would attend that court date. You would need to be there. And then generally speaking, the judge will grant it on that date. We have had a few judges lately that have been requesting more information on their own, even on non-objections. So in that event, it'd get continued and we'd prepare as though it was an objection hearing. But most cases still get granted.
Yeah, that's not the norm.
That's not the norm, and that is,
and historically hasn't.
has not been. Yeah, for years it was never an issue at all.
Right.
And that's kind of the same in suburban Cook County. If there's no objection, the judges in all 5 of the suburban districts right now will grant all non-objections without issue. And so, again, you could expect a court date that we would attend, you wouldn't need to, and I just am there to ensure the order actually gets entered, and then that case is done.
Got it. So that is a best case scenario, right? That's
Yes.
assuming no objections. What happens if you file a petition and the state objects?
So if the state objects, that means that you're going to need to have a contested hearing. So ultimately, a judge is going to be deciding whether or not to grant this expungement or sealing or both. So in that event, we'll talk with you some more, because at this point we'll want to get more information to present your best argument to the judge about why this should be granted. And so it's what they call a balancing test. So ultimately the judge is deciding whether your interest in having this record expunged or sealed outweighs the state or the people of Illinois' interest in still having access to it. And so the judge will be looking at not just what the case itself was and how long ago it was, how serious, et cetera, but also what's going on in your life. So what reasons do you have for wanting this off your background? So that can be stuff related to inability to get a job, inability to get a job in the field that you're otherwise qualified for. If you have children that you're supporting, that also adds to the, or other family members, why you might need to be employed. Housing situations, like I mentioned. And then also can be other kind of factors that are not strictly economic. So, your presence in the community. So often we have people get character reference letters from people who've known them. If you do any volunteer work in the community, that can be a thing as well. If you're already working, a lot of times you like to get employment verification. So someone that, a supervisor at work saying that they know you to be a good worker and trustworthy, stuff like that. And so the judge is going to look at all of that evidence and then, listen to you. If you're interested, you can speak directly to the judge as well. And then they'll listen to the state, and they'll usually give a list of all the cases that you've been arrested for and maybe give some facts on the ones they consider serious. And then the judge makes a decision whether to grant or deny the request.
How long does it usually take the judge to make a decision?
These hearings are pretty short, and so I'd say maybe 5 to 10 minutes on average. So this is not a rigorous thing. There's no evidence, rules of evidence, or any kind of lawyerly things like that for the most part. It's just each side says their piece. The judge usually gives us the final word, and then they'll make their decision. One thing to note with this is that these days, everywhere except for at Bridgeview Courthouse in Cook County, all those hearings are by Zoom. And so that's a nice thing. I think it's been really good for self-represented litigants, but even people with attorneys, like if you're working with us, because you don't have to leave your home to go to a courthouse. Especially if you have cases in multiple places, you might end up traveling, to 4 different, courthouses all over Cook County. It can be a lot of work. Now you can do all of that from home. Although if you don't feel comfortable with it, you can always still go to the courthouse in person if you want.
It's a very important thing to note, because a lot of people are either intimidated by the prospect of coming to court or have some obstacles that they have to surmount in order to physically get to court. Sometimes transportation can be a challenge.
Yeah.
And in the majority of cases in Cook County right now, you have the option of doing it by Zoom.
Exactly. So that's not just expungement. That's most types of cases these days are held over Zoom for most things. And expungement, like I said, even contested hearings, everywhere except for District 5 Bridgeview Courthouse, which does its contested hearings in person. Anywhere else that you're doing an expungement, including the city of Chicago, you'll be doing it over Zoom unless you want to go in.
Right. So that's a really interesting development, I think, and has had the impact of expanding access to the process for a lot of people who might not take advantage of it otherwise. What happens if things don't go your way? What happens if the petition to expunge or seal is denied?
So that does happen. Most of our cases, I would say, even when contested, we still win a majority at hearing. But we do have some denied. So one thing to note is the judge has discretion here. So just because it's eligible doesn't mean that it's going to happen. The judge ultimately decides everything. But that also means sometimes they'll grant stuff in part and then deny in part. So for instance, they might move a case of yours that was eligible for expungement and say, well, I want law enforcement to still see it, I'm going to seal it. Mm-hmm. Or they might grant some cases but not others and keep other things on. There can be other variations of that sort of thing. The good news is if you're denied outright or denied partially, there's no rule saying you can't go back in and file to expunge or seal again. And in fact, you could, if you wanted, file as soon as the next day. I wouldn't recommend doing it because there's a pretty good chance you're just going to go right back in front of the same judge in a few months, and so that's not ideal because they'll remember you and say, well, why are you here again?
Right.
But usually I'll advise people wait a year or so and then try again, because the nature of criminal records, the longer it's been since the last case happened, the stronger your case for getting it expunged is. So every year that goes by, your odds improve a little bit.
Right. And you have more evidence accumulated to show that that it's in society's interest for you to be able to move forward without that obstacle.
Exactly, Adam. And so, you can do other things during that time as well, as far as, I mentioned some of that mitigation evidence of character references, volunteer work in the community, things like that, plus the passage of time. And then another kind of practical consideration is judges rotate in and out of hearing these calls. So if you wait a little while, the next judge will see that you filed previously, but it might not be the same individual, and so that can help a little bit. Occasionally, we'll have judges recommend trying to do other things in the interim. There can be a petition for a certificate of good conduct or something like that, and that's sort of like a judicial stamp saying that they think that you're a good person now, but they don't want to expunge your records. That's kind of a relic of a time before expungement and sealing, whereas readily available for different case types in Illinois, but it is a thing you can do while you're waiting, and I have had that help a few people. So there can be other little things like that you can do while you're waiting to refile.
Okay, so all of this is very helpful information for anybody who has this issue and is facing this issue in their lives. I would like to talk to you a little bit more about the New Leaf program, which you mentioned. Now, this is a relatively recent thing, too, and it has to do with the change in the law regarding marijuana in Illinois. Can you talk a little bit more about the change, both the change in the law and the impact that that's had on the process and what we do to participate in that program as a service provider?
Yeah, so in, I believe, January 2020, cannabis was legalized at the state level in Illinois. The law passed before it, but it didn't go into effect until then. And so, that's meant that people can buy cannabis for recreational purposes in Illinois at licensed dispensaries. But as part of that, because people, have been getting arrested up until the day before that in Illinois for cannabis, possession, manufacture, and delivery, the legislature also put into place a process for expunging those past criminal records. So some of this stuff happened automatically. For non-convictions, there was a process to remove the police records for non-convictions, and that was done by the Illinois State Police. However, the court records for those are still out there, and that's a little bit unfortunate because court records are what most places use for their background checks. So the good news there is they also set up a process for legal aid agencies such as Greater Chicago Legal Clinic to get funding to expunge people's records in court. And so that includes those cannabis convictions, but also the non-convictions as well that were partially, automatically expunged. So we can go in and expunge the court versions of those too, which is good because that's what does the most good. And so this is a statewide thing. It's not just us, and it's not just Cook County or Chicago. So if you've been arrested for cannabis anywhere in the state of Illinois, you can get that assistance. And essentially, if you contact the New Leaf program, if you're not totally sure where all your cases are, they'll do that work for you and get you referred out to the appropriate legal aid providers in different counties, different areas. They'll do all that for you for free. And then, the legal aid, such as us, at that point takes over, and we'll file the actual petition in court and get it granted, hopefully.
So that's an incredible resource for people who've previously been impacted by marijuana arrests or convictions. Obviously, the society's attitude on marijuana has shifted considerably, and so has the law. I think a lot of people have very rightly been asking, why should I continue to have to pay a penalty for something that is no longer illegal? And this is a program that addresses that issue and helps make good on the promise that the law has made. In the time that we have left, I wanted to just talk a little bit more about the live call. Actually, we haven't talked at all about the live call, and that's an important part of what we do. It's very similar to what you've already discussed in terms of the underlying law and procedure, but tell us what the live call is and how the clinic assists at the live call.
Yeah, so this is a project that goes back over 10 years at the clinic now, and essentially we provide assistance for litigants who don't already have an attorney that filed an expungement or sealing case and are now up for a hearing on a contested issue. So this is not the non-objections that we discussed earlier. Those, again, should be granted automatically, and if for some reason it's not, we would contact you then. But if we know that there's an objection, whether from the judge or the state's attorney to your case, we'll contact you in advance and offer your services for free to represent you, have an attorney represent you at that hearing. And so this is big because the other side is the state's attorney, and so they're an attorney. It's a judge who's an attorney, and so it's nice to have someone on your side that knows the law. Many of these objections are statutory in nature, meaning that the person applied for relief they're not eligible for, and often it can be corrected. So it's something like switching a case from expungement to sealing, or providing a drug test. If you have a drug-related conviction, you need to submit that in order to have it granted. It could be other things like that too. So we provide assistance fixing those issues, the technical issues, but then also arguing to the court the balancing test issue of whether or not this should be granted. So we'll help explain to you the nature of the objection, suggest mitigation evidence that you can gather and submit to the court, which we'll do for you, and then actually have an attorney arguing those points to the judge, again, free of charge.
So that's an incredible resource that we would encourage people to take advantage of. The clinic really exists to help people in that situation where you can't necessarily afford an attorney on the private market and you think, well, I'll just go ahead, I'll file the petition myself, and then you're surprised to find out that the state's attorney is objecting to your petition. And then you find yourself in a position where you, a non-lawyer, are faced with going up against a professional prosecutor in front of a judge, and you might not even fully understand the reason why your petition is being objected to. That's where somebody like Drew comes in, or clinic attorneys who serve on the live call, and they can step in at that moment and help you. So we would encourage you, if you're in that kind of position, not to try to take the law into your own hands, so to speak, and to take advantage of that resource. We have a phenomenal attorney here in Drew Curle. Drew, thanks for everything that you do.
Yeah.
And thank you for tuning into Legal Aid Explained. If you have a problem and think you could use some legal services, we encourage you to call 312-726-2938. Contact the Greater Chicago Legal Clinic for low cost and free legal services. And we will see you next time on Legal Aid Explained.